Hi, I'm Paul Baxendale, and welcome to this week's blog post, number 8 in the series. And this week, we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of my competitive career, way back to the late 1980s. Blog post number 8, first mentors, influences, and building a foundation. I was tempted to go straight into another blog post about one of my sessions with Dorian, but let's build up to that. It was a chess workout I was going to tell you about, and there's a valuable story in how it all came about. People would often say how lucky I was to have that opportunity. But when you hear the story, maybe you'll see that there was much less luck involved and more planned, intense commitment. This is what Marcus Aurelius had to say about luck and making your own good fortune. You say good fortune used to meet you at every corner, but the fortunate person is the one who gives themselves a good fortune. And good fortunes are a well-tuned soul, good impulses, and good actions. So instead, today's blog is taking us way back to my beginnings and the very first mentors that I had, the people that gave me the valuable lessons and real deal knowledge that has stayed with me through all of these years, and also some knowledge that I learned was not right for me, and how you can distinguish between the two. In this day of social media, the internet, and also of the so-called gurus in every gym, it seems so very easy to be inundated with information and advice, but much of that advice often contradicts each other. Some will be useful, some is downright dangerous. So let's get down to what you really need to know and how to make it simple and to remove the BS from the sport. It's not rocket science. Believe me, it's really very simple. Unfortunately, people don't like simple, especially when simple is also brutally hard, gut-wrenching work that no one else is prepared to do for you. I can only tell you the truth. I don't lie. And those are the facts. Simple, brutally hard, insane training intensity and gut-wrenching work for maximum effort in minimum time, and to allow the recovery for your muscles and your central nervous system to rest and grow. As previously mentioned in prior posts, I had already met Jeff King, Lee Haney, Tom Platz and Mike Quinn and several other American pro bodybuilders very early on in my teens, but I was really too young to fully appreciate their advice. Plus at that point, I didn't know that I would one day want to become a pro bodybuilder. Yes, I was in awe of them, but I didn't yet have the vision of myself being like them. So I never asked a bunch of questions that I would love to have asked a little bit later. To be honest, I could not at that time even visualize my young athletic body being capable of carrying so much muscle. It was almost beyond my internal vision of what I thought I was capable of. But maybe I should have had more faith in myself. I wish I'd known the words of Aurelius when he teaches us that how we do anything is how we do everything. And in continuing to train consistently and eat religiously and to sleep like a monk, then that dream was, in fact, truly very possible. Pay attention to what's in front of you, the principle, the task, or what's being portrayed. By the time I started training with Johnny Fuller, I had become serious. He could see that commitment. I don't think there was any way he would have taken me under his wing if he hadn't seen that commitment. I was a hard worker, prepared to do whatever it took to make progress. If it was doing 20-25 sets on one exercise, then that's what I would do. And following Johnny's program, that's precisely what we did do. we would spend half an hour at least on any piece of equipment, completely against gym etiquette. But this was Johnny Fuller, the man who stood on stage with Olympians and had trained with Arnold and all the legends at Gold's Gym. What could I do? I wasn't going to say to him that we were stopping other people from using the equipment. I simply followed what he did. He was the expert, I was the beginner. And I didn't know any better at that point. I just thought the owner would just let Johnny train the way he wanted to. Now that turned out to be wrong, as he ended up banning Johnny from the gym shortly afterwards. Probably after a couple of warnings, but I wasn't aware of those. All I knew that Johnny Fuller had been banned from the gym. I couldn't believe it. Fortunately, there were other gyms in the town, and we soon found an alternative, a very good alternative. Not so well equipped, but much more hardcore and a better environment to train all out, as it turned out to be. I was slowly learning the basic rules of life. The chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control. Where do I look for good and evil? Not to uncontrollable externals, but within myself, to the choices that are my own. Now, the reps we were doing were also very high, between 20 and 30, but sometimes going up to 50 reps on a set, especially on legs. The leg press was one of those movements where we would just keep going until our quads literally gave way. After getting pumped, they would get fatigued and they would burn. From there, it was the fibers began to shake and fire involuntarily until you would have to take a brief rest to gather some air. But he always made sure the tension was always on the quads, all the time, never allowing me to lock the legs out. It was a whole new world of pain to me, but it was far from finished. Then came the reps, where they were coming one at a time, and the quads would be giving way, requiring Johnny to grab the leg press before it came down on the racks. Luckily, they had racks so the machine couldn't drop all the way down and crush me. Now that was one set, and we would carry on doing sets over and over and over, a leg workout often lasting 2 or more hours. Oh, what a change there would be when I started training with Dorian. One set. Pay attention to what's in front of you, the principle, the task, or who's being portrayed. The workouts were long, and as much as I enjoyed them, I did feel as though something wasn't quite right. Yes, I knew that Arnold and many of the great old school legends had trained for 5 to 6 hours a day, but I was working a full-time job, and I really wasn't making the progress I thought I should be getting for the investment that I was making in terms of time. Now, maybe my nutrition was lacking, and on Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays and Saturday nights I worked on the door of a nightclub and inside as security. And who also worked on the door with me? Yes, Johnny Fuller. There were a few bodybuilders working the doors back then, and it was a very good job in those days. There wasn't much trouble, really good teams, good lads, great lads, and very good money in the hand. And a chance to talk to Johnny all night about training, nutrition and bodybuilding. Back then, I was still completely natural, so the steroid conversation was never really raised, apart from a couple of times when I asked purely out of interest, not thinking that it would make such a difference in somebody's physique anyway. There was a lesson in here for me in terms of not depending totally on someone else's philosophy or way of training. As Seneca said, show me someone who isn't a slave, one is a slave to lust, another to greed, another to power, and all are slaves to fear. I could name a former consul who is the slave of a little old woman, a millionaire who is slave of the cleaning woman. No servitude is more abject than the self-imposed. Never be a slave to any emotions. Never let emotions rule your life. Instead, rule your life with action, honor, virtue, and honesty and integrity. Then you will never be a slave to anyone. Now, Johnny was a great source of knowledge on all aspects of bodybuilding, but no more so than that of nutrition. He was a big believer in organ meats, offal, such as liver, heart, kidneys, and even tongue, and parts of the animal the butcher would normally throw out or use for burgers. Working with Johnny was a real pleasure. Although he spent most of the night just leant against the wall, I can see him now, not really worried about what was going on inside. He was always ready to step in if he had to and resolve a few disagreements that we had inside. I remember one night there was a very big off inside the club, somewhere Johnny rarely ever went, but it was messy in there. There was quite a few guys going for it in the middle of the club, and before a few seconds the whole place had erupted. It was like a war zone in there. So I went in with a couple of the lads and left a message for Johnny to be ready to remove whoever was passed to him. So we set up something like a conveyor belt. We would grab one pugilist, put him in a lock, throw him to the next doorman in line, who would pass him on to the next in line, and on, so forth, until they got Johnny, and Johnny would then just throw them out of the door. Now, seeing Johnny, they were always very reluctant to return to argue the point. Johnny's guns are always on show. Within a few minutes, the club was just as it had been 15 minutes earlier, nice and peaceful. The system worked very well, and Johnny hadn't even had to move from his spot on the door. Perhaps Johnny had heard the stoic response to wrong action and evil. The person who does wrong to themselves. The unjust person is unjust to themselves, making themselves evil. I can't say I enjoyed the violence. I much preferred talking people out of embarrassing situations. A quiet word to them nearly always worked, like, what would you rather do? Would you rather gently and quietly leave the club right now, or would you rather have all your friends see me drag you out of the club? Now, it nearly always did the trick, but on the occasion they didn't. Well, anyway. But there was a gentleman who occasionally caused me problems, an old gypsy bare-knuckle fighter. Now, he was a great guy outside of a club and when he hadn't been drinking, but with a wad of notes in his pocket on a Saturday night and 26 pints in his belly, he would never leave without challenging me to an arm wrestle. That's probably a story from another blog post. He was a great character. Despite the trouble, he was a really good guy, and I was really quite sad and upset when I heard that he had died one evening through an alcohol and heroin overdose. A character worth remembering his good virtues, and those he let slide, well, for another day. It's important to take these quotes seriously. You see, philosophy isn't a parlour trick or made for show. Without it, no one can live without fear or free from care. Countless things happen every hour that require advice, and such advice is to be sought out in philosophy. Truly, if you remember these words and store up a library of quotations of them, you will equip yourself for the life ahead to be unmoved by life's storms, life's triumphs, and life's suffering. You will continue on your path of your true purpose. Now, Johnny lived in a huge modern tower block right in the centre of Swindon. It was called the David John Murray Building. And he lived there with his girlfriend, Della Shahabi, who was also a pro female bodybuilder. But the relationship was a volatile one. It was off and on. And Johnny was often quite depressed at times. But eventually they went their separate ways. I think they both found it was a good decision for both of them. And Johnny was then single for as long as I knew him afterwards. He often invited me back to his apartment in the tower block. Now, it wasn't a tower block like in the cities. It was actually a very upmarket looking place at the time. And he'd always show me a way of preparing food or offer me something to eat or drink there. His favourite drink for bodybuilding, not for taste, I don't think, was raw liver blended up and then neck down in 1 or 2 gulps. The first time I saw him do this, I thought he was winding me up. I'd heard him say how many desiccated liver tablets he took every day. But raw liver blended up in its natural state and juices, that was another thing altogether. I'd started taking desiccated liver tablets myself, but then one day he offered me his normal post-workout drink. Of course I said yes, thanks Johnny. But then he took the raw liver out of the fridge and blended it up right in front of me until it was smooth. Now I would say kind of like ice cream smooth, but that would very much give you the wrong idea. As he passed me the blended liver, I really had to think twice. Now, I didn't want to offend Johnny, but then again, I really didn't fancy necking down raw blended liver. But my heart won, and I thanked him and took the blender and necked it down straight, trying not to let it touch the sides so I wouldn't taste it. Now, I got it down, but I couldn't help but taste it. I do, though, think that often is a much underrated food source and neglected by athletes and bodybuilders. But that doesn't mean that you have to go out and buy a blender and mix up some raw liver each day. Dig deep within yourself, for there is a fountain of goodness ever ready to flow if you will keep digging. You see, Johnny was a big believer in offal or organ meats, whether it was kidneys, heart or liver. He ate them every day. It's something that you just don't see today. All I hear is people talking about their chicken or their turkey or egg whites or steak. I think it's a big mistake to ignore the nutrient-dense liver and kidneys. Now, you don't have to drink them raw as we did. You can cook them. I do think they taste better that way. Now, another quote about personal responsibility, because it was my choice to drink that concoction, and I'm glad I did try it. If we judge as good and evil only the things in the power of our own choice, then there is no room left for blaming gods or being hostile to others. Don't ever blame others. Hold the cross of responsibility yourself and move forwards with it. Well, I continued to work in the nightclub for years, but Johnny left at some point and moved down to Bournemouth on the south coast of England to live, and he got another job down there as a doorman again. I never saw Johnny again, sadly. I never spoke to him again. The next thing I knew, Johnny had cancer, and then he had died. A terrible loss to the bodybuilding world, but also to his friends who loved and admired him. Sadly, he never truly got the recognition he fully deserved from the magazines nor from the bodybuilding world. He had the biggest calves I've ever seen on a black man. They were crazy. His conditioning was so far ahead of his time. It was crazy. Granite dry, vascular, shredded, thick, dense muscle. He was awesome. Now, he tore his pec in the States at one point towards what would become the end of his career, because obviously his placing suffered after that injury, especially because he failed to get his pec reattached. For some reason, choosing to leave it alone and trying to rebuild it, but you could never miss the pec on stage. It was half the size of the other one, and it had shrunk where the pec had bunched up into the centre after the tear. Now, why he didn't have an operation, I don't know. He did have access to what's called the National Health Service here in the UK, and I'm sure they would have reattached it if he had insisted upon it, but he chose not to. Now, he did tell me a lot of stories from the US, and he did also tell me about how his pec had been torn. The stories about the States were always a little bit sad, and it was clear that Johnny didn't fit the look that Joe Weider and the magazines were after for training articles, and certainly not front covers. And he didn't get much support despite his incredible physique. And the even sadder thing was that he knew it, and he knew why. The blue-eyed, all-American blonde bodybuilder was what sold magazines, and Johnny didn't fit the bill. Even though he had one of the freakiest bodies of nearly anyone on stage during that time. Was Johnny bitter about his career and the way it had been supported by the IFBB and the Weeders? I think it's fair to say he was. He never came out openly and said anything disparagingly about them. But he also made it very clear that he was disappointed and had had his career relegated to almost a bit part because of his look. Those who know me and my posts will know that I'm not a man to dwell on the negatives or criticize people, as I don't believe it's any use or any good for any of us. And it doesn't add anything positive to our world around us. However, there are certain issues, particularly in the past, which need to be openly said and addressed and acknowledged. The first being that black bodybuilders, despite often being predominantly the very best in the world over the years, had not been given the respected rights to cover photos, articles and marketing contracts that the white bodybuilders were given. You only need to go back to Sergio Olivier to see that. While Sergio was working 12-hour shifts in an iron mill and then working out for 3 hours afterwards with no support from any of the magazines, Arnold was given a weekly wage, a car, and opportunities to make money and front covers and marketing adverts that Sergio never had. Look, of course, Joe Weider had a business to build and make successful, and the figures showed that a white, blue-eyed, blonde bodybuilder on the cover of a magazine sold more issues than an edition with a black bodybuilder on the cover. I think, to be fair, rather than blame Joe Weider for running with the numbers, it's equally fair to just blame society for being so biased to their buying baits, which was simply a reflection of the society at that time. We can only hope that as societies move forwards, and it does move forward, that, and I know it often feels painfully slow at times, that the situation is changing. What feels great is to see people like Kai Green and the most popular bodybuilder on the planet, and Phil Heath, the second biggest bodybuilder on the planet. You know, even Dorian had his issues with covers and conflicts with being over here in the UK, and was very much deemed a rebel by the Weeders for some time. But Dorian managed to turn it to his advantage by adopting the shadow persona strategy, which was basically his own personality anyway. But it's interesting to see how he had to fight at times to avoid being drawn into the LA living. Now, Dorian certainly had thought of the possibility at times. He had been offered a huge contract by Vince McMahon of the newly formed WBF to switch federations from the IFBB and to compete with them. And you couldn't have blamed him if he had chosen to do so. He was pretty much broke at the time. He was living in Birmingham in the small rented apartment that he, Debbie and his son Lewis had lived in ever since he began his bodybuilding career. Despite being British champion, I think the only sponsorship that had come his way had been from a British supplement company called Tropicana. And they had Dorian advertise some of their products. Now, there was also Kerry Kayes. Now, Kerry, I've spoken to you about a number of times, but he was literally the man who supported British bodybuilding completely at that time. And then in the future, His role just increased all the time. He started Chemical Warfare Supplement Company with Paul Borison, and then CNP Supplement Company after he and Paul had to part. As owner of CNP, Kerry sponsored pretty much every athlete worth sponsoring at the time, giving sponsorships away to many people who would never have received any other offer. Really, he was just trying to assist them into making their journey to improve as bodybuilders just that little bit easier. Then he began to promote the British Grand Prix, where he would bring over, just 1 week after the Olympia every year, almost the entire Olympia lineup for British fans to see in person in their Olympia conditioning just days after the big show. Now, that must have cost a fortune. Now, I don't know if Kerry made money out of that event or not, but the fans in the UK were blessed to have Kerry putting that show on, and Kerry sponsoring classes at almost every show in the UK during the year, and then sponsoring a whole team of athletes on top of that. Well, Kerry had helped Dorian when he first started out winning shows in the UK, until he got his WIDA contract after he won his first Olympia in 1992. So you can see why Dorian would and could have been tempted by the offer of big money by the WBF. However, Dorian's goal wasn't huge riches, although he hoped they would come his way. His goal was to become Mr. Olympia, and he knew somewhere inside of him that he had what it took. I remember once in one of our post-workout chats together, he told me of the promise he made to Debbie before his first pro show, the 1990 Night of Champions in New York. Now, if he didn't place in the top 3, he was going to retire from competing and turn his mind to something else, as he felt that all the champions had nearly always broken through almost straight away. So if he hadn't been noticed at that first Night of the Champions, then that was going to be that. Now, we all know the story. He came second to Mohammed Benaziza, and he lost to him because of Momo's better back development. Now that's strange to think of, isn't it? But it proved to be Dorian's greatest victory, in a way, because for an entire year afterwards, he stuck a picture of Momo's back on his fridge door. And so every time he looked at the fridge or went into the fridge to get some food, there it was, a reminder that he had to focus on improving his back to become the victor. In that year following, he focused like never before on his back training heavier, stricter, squeezing more, contracting more, and recovering better. And the next year the result was, yes, his back had improved, and he won the show, qualifying him for the 1991 Mr. Olympia later that year. He had proved himself right. His faith had been justified, and as Lee Haney would discover, there was a new beast on the block. That pushed Lee very hard before he finally defeated Dorian to win his 8th Olympia victory. I believe Lee won that show pretty much straight firsts, but Dorian had defeated Lee Haney in the muscularity round, so the writing was on the wall. So from Johnny to Dorian, I was blessed to have Olympia contenders as my training partners. Only it was Dorian's high intensity, low volume, one working set to failure and beyond that made the difference in how my body grew. I have photos of me before training with Dorian, and then photos taken just 8 months later. And it looks like I put on about 30 pounds of muscle. And no, it didn't have anything to do with supplementation, as some people would love to think. It was all down to the training and the recovery. Well, that's the story of my first mentor, Johnny Fuller. There were others through the years, and not all pros and not all well-known amateurs either, but there were some great ones. In fact, you'd be surprised to read about the many, many ordinary bodybuilders that helped and influenced me and gave me helping tips and support along the way There were great ones. There were Gary Sheldermean, Ian Harrison, Graham Black, and I mustn't forget Paul Borison, who I always knew as the mad professor in a very kindly way. Paul was a real character and a very clever man and a very nice guy. And I promise I will do a full blog post on Paul in the very near future. In fact, maybe the role of these people could be my next blog, as it's important for us all to realise that however insignificant we may feel we are in this industry and this world, whether we know it or not, we may be influencing someone ourselves this week. So think about how you react and interact with people, especially young guys and girls starting out in the gym. For you never know, you may be that person that lights the fire for them to become the next Mr. or Miss Olympia. Mentors. We like to say that we don't get to choose our parents, that they were given by chance. Yet we can truly choose whose children to be. A quote by Seneca illustrating that just because you can't get to choose your parents, it doesn't mean that you don't get to choose who your role models and your mentors are. So there I was, in the small town of Swindon in England. I had become the town's biggest and best bodybuilder. In all humility, I don't think anyone would have argued with that at the time. And yet I'd been to the seminars of Lee Haney, Patrick Nichols, Tom Platz, Frank Richards, Brian Buchanan, Bill Kazmaier, and trained alongside other up-and-coming national level competitors like Pete Chapman. And I knew I was missing something major. The high volume, high rep approach wasn't working out for me. I was growing, but it was painfully slow and not worthy of the effort I'd been putting in. I knew there was a better way. Now I had been reading articles about Dorian, and I could see that he was different. He was a whole world of different. At the 1988 or 89 Sidmouth Classic, I had been in the tall class when the guest poser had walked past me to go on. It had been Dorian. And as this monstrous mass walked past me, it was literally, what the hell was that? All I could see as he moved to the darkness of the centre stage were his calves. These huge, ginormous balls where a normal human's calves should be. It was almost prehistoric. The lights were off, darkness surrounded the hall, and the tension was so tight you could have cut it. Everybody in the room knew that there was something up on that stage that was otherworldly. As the music began and he transitioned to his first pose, a lat spread, the lights came on and the place erupted with screams and yells of noise. People were shocked, impressed, awed, but most of all, I was dumbstruck, but thinking, now that's what I want. As his routine finished and the applause abated and silence then returned to the hall, the compere called out the next class, the tall class. And yes, I was number one. So on I strolled, the first athlete to come on after Dorian's 300-pound plus off-season form. To say I was a letdown to the crowd is to put it nicely. They must have been very disappointed beyond comparison after seeing that behemoth when my 95 kilos walked on stage to appropriately Guns N' Roses' Live and Let Die. What a night. So from there, where a young Jason Corrick was also competing, a future NABBA Mr. Universe, I went home to plan my attack for the year. I would get my head down, train like a beast, recover better, live like a monk, and see how I could improve and maybe give the NABBA South a go the following year, which led me to the NABBA British Finals, and then to my fateful trip to Temple Gym. As it happened, I had another show later that year in Torquay at the English Riviera Championship, at which I placed third in my very ever first show. And I returned to win the entire show and overall the very next year. A nice feeling and victory, but very short-lived. I knew I was swimming in the small ponds, and that what I really wanted to do was live in the big boys' world, that of the professional bodybuilders. So rather than take a break and relax, I went straight back to work to try and improve every aspect of my life. My relationships, my training and my work, at which I won a fully paid holiday to the Cannes Film Festival, which I went to just 2 weeks after I had competed, which I did cause a few crowds to build on any beach I happened to go on. They thought I was a film star or a pro athlete. Well, that's really nice, I thought, and flattering, as my photograph was being taken everywhere. But what I really wanted for them to think was, oh, there's a professional bodybuilder. And I obviously hadn't achieved that look yet. Well, that's another roll down memory lane, with memories of the breakthrough years of Dorian and of the great years with my first ever mentor and my friend and my brother in iron, Mr. Johnny Fuller. God bless you, Johnny. Thank you for listening to another blog post. I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.